beyond the net zero. A little bit closer, perfect. As you may know, the UNEP emission gap report came just a few weeks ago, and it said that it is very likely, it's inevitable, that we're going to have an overshoot, that we're going to go beyond 1.5 degrees. And I'm sure by now everybody that is at the climate COP also knows that the IPCC AR6 has a very clear message how CDR is needed for delivering a potential delivery of the temperature targets. You also probably know that the methodological report for IPCC that focus on CDR will come out in 2027, so that's where we will get a little bit additional guidance on how to incorporate CDR in our efforts. And we'll go into this a little bit more in a presentation, but there's about 20 countries that have included CDR in their NDCs. And this is not the latest information from yesterday when another country submitted their NDC, and we're now at 122 countries. But at least a few weeks back, it was about 20 countries that have included CDR in their NDCs. So I want to say that there is, in the corridors here and in the negotiations, I think there is an overall good understanding and agreement that CDR is not a replacement of mitigation, but it's a complement, and it's a necessary complement for us to deliver. And you're probably also all familiar with the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal report, where it says that about 2 gigaton a year is being removed from the air. Let's put that in the context of that we would need roughly 10 gigaton to be removed. And I tried to get the AI to help me a little bit understand how much 10 gigaton is. If you would take that gas and put it across the entire of the Brazilian surface, it would be about 6 centimeters on the surface. And that's in terms of a gas, but if you would look into weight, it would be about 2,000 Giza pyramid. So every year we have to figure out where to take this amount and put it somewhere. And okay, those that are on the web link may not see, but in this pavilion we have on the back wall we have a good listing of those opportunities for CDR. So today we will look at the intersection between countries, local authorities, and how markets can incorporate safeguards and also build up the very large industrial level carbon dioxide removal. And with that, Nico, I would like you to, sorry, actually I'm going to Henrik first, sorry. That's where there's small changes in it. So Henrik Silja Nielsen is the Deputy Director for the Department of International Climate Policy at the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. So both EU and Denmark are looking at including CDR in the solutions. So if you could help us understand a little bit where we are going with that. And I think we can also now sit down.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me today. It is a great privilege to engage in discussions on CDR. Let me also just highlight that it's actually pretty counterintuitive, but due to our position as EU president, I better highlight that I almost solely speak on behalf of Denmark and present our Danish policies. There are a few things we fleshed out at the European level. And I think it's pretty clear, just a few days ago, the government announced their intent to have a reduction of 82 to 86% by 2035. That's likely the most ambitious reduction target, at least among industrialized countries on Earth. We are always ranked in the very top of ambitious industrialized countries. the government has put aside 4 billion USD to support CDR from 2029 to 2044. And I know we're not there yet, but basically the intent is that we will have 2.3 billion tons per year put in the soil from 2030 and onwards. We believe, but it still has to be fully fleshed out, that we have a potential of around 10 million tons per year in Denmark. Let me also just say that science has been up for discussion lately, also to some extent at this COP. But it's also clear, and that's why I'm extraordinarily delighted to speak at a UNEP event, that we need to engage in this discussion. The Secretary General of UN made it clear that we are at the brink of passing the 1.5 degree target. That's just a fact. And that also means that we need to change the entire narrative of this race to zero that we are currently stuck in. It is a narrative of yesterday. The narrative of the future is the race to net negativity. From the government side, we have lost our net zero target by 2045. And I hope and expect that it will be put into law by next year, that we will have a 110% reduction target by 2050, thereby making us to my knowledge, the first industrialized country to have a net negative target based on a technical CDR. That's where we are at right now. And, it's clear that the national policies themselves are not sufficient. And I think that's also why I'm very delighted to be here and had the honor of speaking for a few events, because generally speaking, I think we have a tendency that we forget how we made the green transition. And oftentimes it's presented as domestic policies that led into a green transition. And of course, I acknowledge the role of innovative companies that we also see today, and the fact that we have a business case coming up. And to some extent, I think it's also often underplayed the total expected revenue stream coming out of this business in just a couple of years from now, and of course looking a decade ahead. But we need to put it into perspective. We need an IA of CDR. We need to be better at sharing our knowledge, sharing our best practices, but also time was up. No, but we need to also to share our failures, and we have launched these goals. Hopefully, we will exceed them. But it's clear, as well as the case with our green energy transition, there have been a lot of failures along the way. We need to have the courage to share those. This is not, I think, it will not entirely be a political win, but we will also have to share when we have made the grave mistakes. They will come. I would also highlight another thing here, CDR, which I think is often underplayed, namely that I see a tendency that we are not fully acknowledging the pathways we pursue. And the reason why I'm saying that is that oftentimes when I have engaged in dialogues with experts, but also policy advocates on CDR, there's a tendency that we made an artificial distinction, artificial line of difference and disagreement between technical CDR and nature-based solutions. And I really think that we need to look beyond that. All of those reasons, to sum up, is the reason why we decided to create the group of negative emitters, GONE, because the emissions need to be gone. But the idea was really to put together global south, global north states, share our experience, but also share a vision of changing again the narrative, but also a vision of spirit to greater ambition at the global level, and also to acknowledge that the pathway we pursue is different from the one that Busan will pursue. They're also a member of our group, and different from the one that Finland pursues. This, I think, is extraordinarily important. And in this COP, there's a tendency that when we sit in negotiation, the disagreement become visible. But this action track and events like these also highlight that we do actually share an overreaching strategy, and we hope that God will develop into perhaps not the IA of CDRs, but at least the first organization that can really put together countries, businesses, NGOs that share the same vision as we do. Thank you very much, and you're more than welcome to support and become a member of God. Thanks.
Thank you, Henrik. Before I let you go, perhaps a question now. Over the last few years, the community around CDR is clearly growing. As a lead or an initiator of the GON initiative, do you see that other countries are waking up and more and more countries reaching out to Denmark for how you can collaborate on this?
Yes, very much, and indeed. And let me just make a parallel, if I may. We also have the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which basically is an alliance where it has developed more, but where we share our experience in having a target of phasing out our own gas and oil exploration. And I see the same developments here, namely that there are a few countries that are willing to become a member and may also take the political risk that entails. But we have even more countries, as well as companies, contacting us because they are interested in seeing if they can, behind the lines, get some input as to how we do this. But it is, unfortunately, I think, still a bit political sensitive. I acknowledge right now that it will come with a cost. But in the long run, I really think we shouldn't underestimate that there is also a business case put into this. We have our great colleague from Lego here, and of course, at the end of the day, there is also a great opportunity for quite a few countries to turn this into a business case that can also facilitate that the non-state actors are really doing the utmost, but also pursuing a strategy to ensure that they will be, if not net negative, then at least climate neutral.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henrik, and perhaps a small applause still for Henrik. Thank you. And then I would like to invite Nico Fairbairn, Head of Partnership and key person in the State of the Carbon Dioxide report. So, Nico, here is the slide changer. So, if you take over and go for the presentation.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, guys. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be presenting on the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal released its first insight report, which is like a mini report. And the topic of this one is analyzing the credibility and transparency of G20 climate pledges. So we analyze nationally determined contributions and something called BTRs, or biannual transparency reports. I assume that if there's any audience that's going to know what a BTR is, it's going to be this one, but these are new to me. They're essentially a more detailed NDC, and they describe in greater detail and at the sector level how a country intends to fulfill its obligations fulfill its pledges that it's set under the NDCs. And so you can see here what's in the scope of this analysis. We assess the CDR pledges against about 6 criteria that I'll go over to understand whether or not they're credible. And what's out of scope, so we cut off the analysis around September 30th. That was when we stopped collecting data on, so if a country submitted their NDCs after September 30th of this year, it was not included in the analysis. And then a little bit of background on what an NDC is, their ratcheting mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. The latest batch of nationally determined contributions was due February of this year, and as we'll see in a moment, countries did a much better job of submitting their BTRs on time than they did their NDCs, at least in the case of G20. So the BTRs were due last December, and almost all G20 countries submitted their BTRs on time, all except India, which I think has still not submitted a BTR. And interestingly, it was the first round of BTRs ever in history. The NDCs we saw, less on-time submission. So let's get into it. What were the main findings from the report? Only 3 G20 members met that February 2025 deadline. However, many more had submitted by September 30th. Less than half of G20 countries submitted their NDC by September 30th, at about 7. 8 members provided enough information for our analysts at State of CDR to actually understand the contribution of conventional CDR to the 2030 targets, which we'll see in a moment is largely inferred through a country's pledges around the LULUCF sector. When I say LULUCF, that's land use change and forestry. No countries in the G20 made updates to their 2030 targets, so they have the opportunity to strengthen the pledges that they set for their 2030 NDCs, and none did that. And then 7 G20 countries took actions to make their pledges credible. And so what are those actions? They're listed at the bottom of the slide. That's the set, whether they've enacted their net zero targets into law, whether they've implemented policies and measures to back up their pledges, and whether they've drafted comprehensive planning to support their pledges. So this table on the right, I think, is one of the more interesting findings from the report. It gives you a sense for which countries submitted their 2035 NDCs, what the current forestry related CO2 emissions are, as well as what the current forestry-related removals are. And so you can kind of compare the removals column to the emissions column and see if there's some countries where removals actually outweigh emissions. And then you can also see we've analyzed which pledges pledged to increase or perhaps predicted a decrease in their LULUCF removals, and which countries outline pledges for novel carbon dioxide removal. And I want to clarify that only one country in its 2035 NDC was very clear about its novel CDR targets, and that's the United Kingdom. This is my favorite table from the report. This is the one that's assessing all of the NDCs and BTRs against our credibility criteria. So you can see, I think it's the top 8 or something countries provided enough information for us to assess their carbon dioxide removal. One of the key things when I asked the authors of this report, what should I tell folks about the process of putting this information together, and they told me it was really difficult actually to understand countries' intentions and expectations about the outcomes of their CDR policies, because they're not usually expressly stated. Instead, we have to infer them from data about LULUCF. Secondly, we assess their credibility against whether or not they have a net zero target enshrined in law. Third, we look at their BTRs to understand current implementation, and we can see whether their BTR just has adequate information to describe conventional as well as novel CDR, and as well as LULUCF projections and comprehensive planning around a published plan to reach net zero. So, big takeaways. Across the board, the pledges failed to deliver a step change in ambition, which puts the Paris Agreement mitigation targets in a precarious position. There remains significant uncertainty in determining how much governments plan to rely on removals versus emissions reductions. This really gets at the heart of, a lot of the fears and skepticism of CDR around this fear of mitigation deterrence, and so I think our analysis just reveals that we need enhanced transparency to continue improving how countries communicate their international pledges on CDR. They calculated an increase in CDR by 2030 of around 214 to 265 million tons of CO2 per year, which at first I thought, oh, that's a lot, it must be the novel, but it's actually, that's all CDR, and so it's actually not a lot of increase in CDR because, as we know, as Nicholas said, 2 gigatons is occurring today, so it's just a small bump on the existing amount, the existing rate of deliveries. Just 8 members of the G20 clarified the role of LULUCFs to their targets. Only the United Kingdom was specified novel CDR in their pledges, which I mentioned before, and that's likely to be delivered primarily through bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And only 3 countries met all the criteria across our analysis, and those were the European Union, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. However, I just want to state that just because the criteria were met for these 3 countries does not necessarily indicate that their current efforts are sufficient. Our analysis, did not assess whether these ambitions are enough. Okay, and then some high-level takeaways, recommendations from the report. While gross emissions are needed, policy and investment conditions continue to scale CDR by 2050 are critical. So what countries should do, what countries should do is submit their nationally determined contributions on time, abiding by norms and obligations of the Paris Treaty Agreement, as well as their BTRs. Secondly, we need to do a better job of clarifying carbon dioxide removal in national pledges and really describing what the expected outcomes are of policies and laws, and distinguishing those CDR targets from gross emissions targets. Third, countries can make their targets more credible by enshrining their net zero targets into law. This helps to create what's called a commitment device, or some kind of accountability mechanism, so that constituencies in at least some jurisdictions can hold future administrations accountable for not following through or falling out of line with a mandate. And lastly, implementing policies and comprehensive planning to sustainably scale CDR. This actually refers to 2 different sort of recommendations, policies and comprehensive planning being kind of separate things. Okay, and then in closing, if you have questions, I am not an author on this report, so not an expert, but I'm doing my best to be a messenger of this report. The co-authors are Will Lamb and Carly Reynolds, who are based at Potsdam. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. You can also find the report using the QR code. Thanks for your time and ears.
Excellent. Thank you, Nico. I actually do have a question for you, and if you have to stretch your knowledge on it, that's okay. So you have been following the progress now in terms of how countries are building up policies and so on. If you would grade the progress since the last NDCs to this NDC, would you give an A, B, C, or D?
I would probably give like a C, because we saw just such a small bump in the amount of carbon dioxide removal that's been proposed, just that 200 something megatons on top of the 2 gigatons that's already being delivered. Also, as you saw, only the UK specified its pledges around novel CDR, so I think we have a lot more progress to be made around how countries intend to use novel CDR to achieve those targets. If you look at the BTRs, you see a lot more details, a lot more policies and minute details and granularity around how countries are implementing policy and regulations around novel CDR. So we know that countries are working on novel CDR more than the UK, but why is the UK the only one that's put it in their NDC at that high level? So I think we have a long way to go, and I also was disappointed to see that no countries in the G20, which represent 75 to 80% of global emissions, strengthened their 2030 targets, instead just proposing 2035 targets. And then the sort of poor rating is also because so many countries were not on time. Why were only 3 countries submitted their NDCs by February? I think that it undermines the legitimacy of international and multilateral collaboration when you don't abide by the Paris Agreement.
Excellent. Thanks, Nico. Indeed, it would be great if those NDCs would have come in much earlier, so then we could do the analysis around them and really know where we are. But this is the situation. 122 of them came in by yesterday, last night. So that's where we are. With that, Nico, I would like you to stay on the podium, but I would like to introduce Mark Preston, the head of carbon accounting for Bellona. And Mark, if you could come, for example, here, and then we need that the slide change, or then Nico, if you could give that. Thank you. And you would like to see them at the same time, okay? Perfect. So that you know what you don't have to look back all the time. Good. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I've been drafted in somewhat last minute to step in for Chris Nigel. Like this. Like this. Like this. Like this. So I've been asked to step in for Chris Nigel. So this won't be quite as compelling as the presentation that Chris Nigel would have given, but I'll try to do my best. I'm head of carbon accounting in Bellona. We're an international NGO working a lot on carbon dioxide removal and the role of carbon management within the climate policy frameworks. And we're also a member of the City CDR initiative. So we've heard a lot about the national level, and we've heard how they're trying to do more, how they're also underperforming. Now I'll aim to talk to you about the city level of CDR. So what is the City CDR initiative? We're trying to build the world's first platform for cities to focus on the deployment and the governance of CDR as a tool for them to reach net zero emissions, not only within their boundaries, but supporting that beyond their boundaries as well. Cities are an important part of they're economic powerhouses within a nation. They have a lot of agency, and often they're sort of underutilizing their potential to effect change at the national level and international level as well. So the City CDR initiative will seek to bring together different cities with varying levels of readiness to share knowledge on how they are performing on CDR, but also to try and identify opportunities to bring CDR into their own city dynamics. So effectively trying to change the narrative around CDR so that we often talk about it as being separate to emission reductions, etc. It's very important in our climate frameworks. We recognize the different climate outcome of a reduction versus a removal. At the same time, it's important that we try to integrate CDR into our emission reduction strategies or other strategies as much as possible so that we're not missing out on any potential opportunities. So two key definitions that the City CDR initiative would like us to reflect on. First is what City CDR refers to the role of cities as an agent in affecting change and in affecting deployment of CDR. So when we say City CDR, we're referring to the governance of CDR within an urban environment. Urban CDR, on the other hand, refers to the deployment of CDR within an urban context, is more of a project-based definition. Those are the two, just to have a bit of a common terminology around what we mean here by City CDR and urban CDR. Now, what is the role of cities in this context? So, there are two roles. There are two main points. One is that cities, on the one hand, have set themselves very ambitious net zero targets. I can think of Oslo, for example, Helsinki, Copenhagen, have very ambitious emission reduction targets that are often more ambitious than their own national targets. So if you want, as the slogan of this pavilion is, there is no net zero without removals. So all these cities that have set themselves net zero targets, they need some amount of removals to be able to reach net zero. At the EU level, there is also the EU 100 climate neutral smart cities mission, which launched sometime 18 months ago. And they have an ambition to reduce their residual emissions to less than 20%. Broadly speaking, this means there's an aggregated need for approximately 128 million tons of CDR per year. And on top of that, there's the Cities Race to Zero campaign, which if we add all of those commitments, amounts to approximately 480 million tons of CDR as required purely to counterbalance the residual emissions in the city context. That's on the demand side. And by demand here, I'm referring to the need, right? This is how much we will be needing CDR if cities want to meet their net zero targets. On the flip side, and I think this is where the City CDR initiative is quite interesting, there is also the potential for cities to generate CDR, to supply CDR not just for their own emissions, but possibly also for other geographies. And there's a lot of different methods that might be applied in the urban context. There are a couple of studies that are mentioned here, which suggest that the potential for CDR within an urban environment could amount to 1 gigaton per year. There's this other study which mentions up to 16 gigatons. This is not CDR necessarily, but the amount of carbon that might be stored within an urban environment. So that's not necessarily only by general atmospheric CO2. But the point here, to illustrate that these numbers are extremely high, this is to highlight that there's a lot of potential for CDR in urban contexts that is currently not being tapped into. One of the reasons why Christian, the founder of the City CDR initiative, wanted to initiate this platform is that he recognizes the value of cities, but also sees that where we are today is that cities aren't really blending in the various different efforts that we need to be doing, and the different priorities that they might have might compete against each other. That in having that kind of siloed thinking, we might be missing out on opportunities to realize net zero. And part of the effort here is to shift the way in which we're thinking about this, so that we're actually embedding CDR into urban planning, and turn city governance into a multiplier, not just for CDR, but possibly also for adaptation policy, for urban resilience, as a way to reduce emissions, etc. And effectively to turn cities into a catalyst for carbon removals. Now, what are some opportunities that we might see? So, in an urban environment, we can think about the use of wooden construction materials in a skyscraper, for example. Those will have some carbon in their biogenic carbon content. There's a possibility of having direct air capture integrated into HVAC systems, the possibility of adding biochar into urban soils, and there are also a lot of point sources that might be located within an urban boundary, like wastewater treatment, or possibly a waste incinerator, or any point source that might be located within an urban context. The idea here is to identify any relevant opportunity within a boundary where we might be able to generate some renewables. But we can also look at this building scale, and here again are some specific examples of how this might be contextualized within planning, not just at an urban, at a city level, but at a much smaller scale within the context of just a new building. How might we think about the role that CDR might play in a new build, in a retrofit of a building? And here are a few different opportunities to store carbon within those contexts. And effectively, this points to the need for multi-level governance. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen the role CDR plays in a national context, and the level of ambition that we're seeing in some of the NDCs. But that obviously then needs to be translated into implementation at a local level, where again cities play a particularly strong role. And there will be a need for national, subnational, and local policy to be able to get all the way to net zero and possibly even net negative. So, what exactly is the point then of City CDR? Well, urban CDR can support other urban priorities to create more livable cities. Might support adaptation policy, resilience policy, emission reduction policy and encourage create better urban living environments. And CDR could be a catalyst for this. It might also be the result of this. And effectively, the idea is to make sure that we're bringing CDR into that program. Cities which are currently very large emitters, they might also be able to turn into carbon sinks. We often imagine that cities might be the ones that are procuring removals from other geographies to be able to counterbalance their own emissions. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way. We're also in a context where maybe at the national level we're not seeing as much climate policy as we would like to see. And cities might be able to step up where national policy or maybe even state policy fails to live up to expectations. And cities are also laboratories for leading climate efforts, to try out new technologies, to try out pilot projects, try out new methods of removing carbon, new methods of building new buildings. And we need to explore cities and the role that they might play in supporting developments that we need to see at the national level, at the global level. It needs to be implemented, and maybe cities is where is the place to start. So thank you very much for this panel discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, quick question for you before we go into the panel discussion. What school grade would you give to cities for how they're progressing on incorporating CDR in their policies, in their decision making? A to D.
D. Well, I work for an NGO, so I have to be very critical. I would say if we could go below D, I would choose to go below D.
Okay.
But I think it's really not part of city planning at the moment. There are very few cities that are considering it. At the moment, we have a lot of cities that set net zero targets because net zero sounds nice, but they don't necessarily realize that net zero means they need to do removals or procure removals to balance out their own emissions. So I would say we're very much at the bottom end of that rating at the moment. Again, it really doesn't have to be that way. And we're saying the State of CDR initiative is trying to make sure that we go up the rankings a little bigger.
But is that an E or an F? And if we go, is it really that bad?
The fact that some cities have net zero targets, I would say F would be extremely harsh.
Okay, good. Thank you, Michael. Then I would like to invite Chris Sherwood to join us on the panel. Chris Sherwood, probably many of you who have been in the pavilion have seen Chris in quite a number of panels already. But Chris is the Secretary General for the Negative Emissions Platform. And I'm afraid that thank you, that Mireia Talla, my colleague from UNEP, who was supposed to help us with connecting to the ecosystems and then the just transition and equity, is stuck in some negotiations, so Mireia is not able to join us. So I would like to start, Chris, with you. So you've heard now from Henrik and from Nico about the governments moving forward. So, and there's like a C grade that they got. On cities, we're really far. So do you see that there's enough support, policy guidance from governments and local authorities for the private sector to do what they do best, innovate, build technologies to advance this topic?
Well, clearly not. Just a quick point, we've now got the rain falling on the tent above, and that does mean we need to be as loud as possible in order to be heard on the live stream, not to mention in the room. So just a couple of tips born from experience: hold the microphone as horizontal as you can, speak as close as possible as you can. It may sound unnaturally loud to you, but I promise you that on the live stream it makes a big difference if you're nice and loud. Yeah, clearly not enough. And whether that's NDCs or city initiatives or other kinds of government planning, governments are way behind where they need to be on carbon removals. I think step one is to understand what carbon removals are. I've had a number of conversations with governments this week which indicate that the machinery of government doesn't even understand what carbon removals are. And then you need to move to a situation where you understand what they are and you decide to assess your country or your city's potential to generate carbon removals. And then you need to move from that into a process of planning for how to achieve, of deciding on what your goals should be, and then planning on what to achieve. And we're, in many cases, not even at that very first step of understanding what CDR is. Other countries understand what it is, but haven't really got to grips with what their potential is. And every stage of that process is still work in progress for every jurisdiction in the world. There is no jurisdiction which has figured out exactly what role CDR is going to play in its net zero plans, and what the targets are, and how it's going to deliver those targets. So we're at a very early stage.
I'm going to ask you also for a grade. So where would you put the private sector and all the organizations? Would you go as Mark's flunk or?
Well, normally grades are given for homework that's been handed in. And I think that in many cases, the class hasn't been given, the information hasn't been provided to the government, so they haven't been able to produce the work which could then be graded. So I would argue that that's maybe not even the right kind of analogy. But I think the private sector is moving further and faster than governments right now in general. There's a small but growing and arguably thriving voluntary market for carbon removals, but that is not going to be enough to get us to the goals that we have. What we ultimately need is for those voluntary markets to convert into large-scale national and global compliance markets. And those compliance markets will essentially be mechanisms that channel finance from sectors of the economy that are emitting and are polluting our atmosphere with CO2, and moving that money into sectors of the economy that are capable of generating carbon removal credits. And if you look at the beautiful graphics that Mark provided, a lot of those things are unique to cities, but a lot of them are things that you can apply outside of cities in rural or smaller communities, and essentially they show that carbon removals is an activity which you don't do in a kind of standalone industry activity that you develop outside in the countryside. It's something which you integrate into the fabric of your economy, and the industries which are able to generate carbon removals and therefore income from carbon removals credits in their compliance market will become more competitive and more resilient and greener and cleaner, and will deliver quality of life benefits for the people in the communities.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet. Could you say a few words about the transparency and how countries can help building transparency for CDR and for private sector cooperate, and especially within the context that everybody is not for CDR. There is also voices against and those that fear that it distracts from mitigation efforts, and that it can, we can go from one ditch to another one. So how can governments help with building the transparency so that private sector can operate?
Yeah, great question. So transparency needs to come at every level of this process, and the first step for transparency is providing, publishing some kind of strategy for achieving your net zero targets and what role carbon removals play in that, and being clear about the differentiation between the emissions reductions piece and the carbon removals piece. So if you can create a separate target for carbon removals, then you can protect, if you like, the emissions reductions target, and carbon removals does not risk being something that undermines your emissions reductions effort. So that's one aspect of transparency. Let's be very clear what element of our action is about carbon removals and what is not. And then certainly the industry needs to be very transparent. So there are, in the absence of regulations, there are ethical standards which need to be developed. The Negative Emissions Platform, my organization, has led in creating an embryonic early first draft of such a standard called the CDR industry commitments, which commits signatories to certain types of transparency. We will need transparency that's delivered through standards like the ones that the registries provide in the voluntary carbon market, standards like the ones that the governments are creating in things like the European Union's carbon removal certification framework, and other tools for transparency as well. So transparency needs to come from the governments, imposed by governments on industry, from industry itself. And then I think it's very useful to have the NGO community really keeping the industry accountable, doing the investigative work, identifying bad practices, and holding the industry to account.
Okay, so perhaps not a perfect grade there either. And Nico, we're still waiting for all the NDCs coming together. But if we think ahead now to the NDCs 4.0, so like 5 years down the line, but we have to start on those NDCs quite soon, frankly, again. What would be your key recommendations for how those NDCs should capture and incorporate CDR?
Yeah, I would say that countries just have a long way to go in backing up those indices. So I think between now and the next submission, which I want to say is every 5 years, countries should focus on creating roadmaps, such as the one we presented on yesterday at the Australia Pavilion. Roadmaps that help to quantify the amount of CDR potential on a geographic basis in a localized way. I think we have more work to do to understand which kinds of CDR are most relevant for given geographies. So there's the comprehensive planning piece, there's policies. Countries can enact all kinds of policies to back up their NDC pledges, such as tax credits, investment tax credits, production tax credits, and then, as I've said before many times, enacting their net zero targets into law, I think, could also help to increase the credibility of their NDCs. We haven't really talked about principles for high integrity CDR, but those can be leveraged as a governance mechanism for any kind of regulatory regime that regulates carbon markets. So whether that's Article 6 or domestic regulation for voluntary carbon markets, we can develop and implement principles that hold carbon removal to a very high standard of durability and verification. I feel like I'm off topic from the NDCs now, so I'm going to stop there.
No, I think you were still on topic there. But as we're getting closer to the end of the session, I would like to move to Mark. Mark, if we're coming up to the gigaton level here, what kind of support, international support do we need in order to get up to gigaton and gigaton every year? And what could be the role of local authorities and local action to deliver those gigatons?
Well, I think step one would really be to make sure that we're nailing the governance of CDR and making sure that it's very clearly included within the long-term climate planning at both national and local levels, within also corporate levels, to make sure that it's very clear that all of those actors need to reduce their emissions down to the lowest possible extent that they can, and in parallel to that, if they can increase the amount of removals that they are deploying to the maximum sustainable level that we can achieve. Both of those truths have to happen at the same time, and we need to be able to hold both of those thoughts in our brains at the same time. The fact that we still don't have separate targets means that it makes it very difficult to be able to keep those things separate. And for us in our work at the EU level, for example, we've been campaigning very strongly alongside Chris and other stakeholders from the CDR community, NGOs, to make sure that there is a separation between reductions and removals in terms of our long-term climate planning. And this is consistent with what the IPCC and what science is expecting of us. So that really is step one. There was discussion around carbon credits, and I think that there is a role for the voluntary carbon market, and I would agree that the voluntary carbon market is a way to try and initiate some demand and some frameworks around how do we account for removals, how do we get money going towards projects, how do we get some final investment decisions on some key projects. Prove that this can be done, even if we don't yet reach the gigaton scale. At the same time, we need to be very clear on how we're going to be transitioning from this voluntary approach towards a compliance approach, and that needs to happen sooner rather than later. Here I'm not necessarily talking about the ETS that often comes up, but to make sure that there is a very clear compliance-based signal where we need to be developing, paying for, and supplying carbon dioxide removal. At the same time, I think that there's a key question we need to be asking ourselves, which is that removals are often understood as being there to counterbalance emissions, when that is indeed one of the roles that it must play if we're going to reach net zero. At the same time, we're trying to reach net negative and actually trying to reduce the atmospheric levels of CO2. There will be a point, which will come sooner than we'd like, where we won't really have the amount of money that is needed to be able to pay for the removals to counterbalance the emissions. If we're relying on a system where one emission costs, say, €100 or $100 or whatever, and the removal is rewarded €100 or $100 or whatever, then eventually you reach a bit of a mismatch where buying a carbon credit as a way to compensate for an emission means you run out of money, and actually you need to trade money at the thin end to just pay for those removals. The point there being that we need to start shifting the carbon removal discussion away from carbon credits towards somewhere where it's almost expected of you if you're going to be putting a product into the market. We have emission performance standards for cars, for example, where eventually we'll be phasing out the internal combustion engine. We can very easily have emission performance standards for the power sector, for example, where we might say that if you want to be producing energy and selling it on the market, you need to stay below a specific emission threshold. Why stop at a number that is above zero, or even why stop at zero? Why not expect that if you're going to put something into the market, you need to have a carbon sink over the whole life cycle, so that you're actually removing more than you are emitting if in production, in the generation of the product, in the provision of your service. And I think that is the longer term vision that we need to have as a society, to be able to shift away from this offsetting mentality and towards a system which is much more able to sustain the need for removals, the amount of removals that we need, in a way that is financially viable. Otherwise, we'll be very much begging the finance ministries to basically throw money at carbon credits, and I think that in the current political situation where we're at, it's not going to fly.
Okay, thank you, Mark. You mentioned a long-term vision, and that's a question that I would like to come to all three of you. So we only have a few minutes left, but if I could hear from a minute, perhaps from each of you, on how can we communicate better about this long-term vision, so that government, local authorities, private sector see where this is going, and that there is the credibility that this is something that must be done, and that it can be done in a way that delivers sustainable development goals, delivers the climate goals, and that we're not going from one ditch into another one. So, Nico, can I start with you? So how do we communicate about that long-term vision of what's needed?
So what I'm hearing is a question about, how can we improve our communication about CDR to bring more people along and to convince maybe more governments and skeptics to kind of believe in CDR. I read a really interesting article the other night that was written by Andreas Malm, the author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline. This was an extremely critical take on carbon credits and markets, and I think that the CDR space writ large can do a better job of engaging honestly with the concerns that are presented in articles like this. I think that we can try to envision more holistic strategies for how we evaluate corporate claims. So what does it mean for a company like Microsoft or some of these other big tech giants to be some of the largest purchasers of CDR? And yes, we are grateful in this space, but what does it also mean for them to then be enabling fossil fuels through some of their other actions in very real ways? I think that we can do a better job of honestly engaging with those questions. And additionally, I'd like to see more emphasis on how we deploy, how we consider environmental justice in communities in which we deploy carbon removal. It does come up quite a bit, especially in the marine CDR space. I hear about it discussed a lot. There's some orgs that are strictly focused on this, such as Carbon 180 in the United States. But I think we have a long way to go there, mostly because we just don't have experience with what deployment looks like. So it's going to be a continual learning process. I'd also recommend the Carbon Business Council. I think has a curriculum on that includes environmental justice and its intersection with the carbon removal space. I hope that's helpful.
No, thank you, Nico. And we were planning to have a little bit more discussion about the environmental justice and that side. Chris.
Yeah, so I'm a communications professional, that's my job. The key thing is always audience, right? So one, who's your audience? And two, what do you want to convince them to do? So in communicating about carbon removals, we have to differentiate between the audiences. If we are talking as a community to the scientific community, to let's say the climate leadership, people like we have here at COP, clearly we need to be relating what we do to targets, to 1.5 degrees, that sort of thing. If we're communicating to the general public and to the politicians who lead them and who are thinking about elections, we need to be relating what we do much more to the impact it has, the value it can offer to people in their daily lives. I read this anecdote from someone recently about electric cars. If you want to tell people to buy electric cars, it's much more effective to tell them that the car drives better, it's more pleasant, it costs you less to run over time, and it's just a much better car than a petrol car. Much better than saying, you should buy an electric car because of the emissions reduction, because half of the people in the population really don't care about the emissions, but they do care that they have a better car.
I think that's a very important one, that if we can communicate with the economic opportunities here, the technological innovation, the direct benefits for people, then we're in a good spot. Mark?
Well, I think two very good interventions on that point. And to build on that, I would add that a lot of the CDR options that we have at our disposal, they have a lot of co-benefits. And I would like to invite the CDR community to reflect on not just prioritizing the CDR that does have co-benefits such as increasing biodiversity, soil health, and those things, but also actually exploring ways in which we can deploy CDR where CDR is actually portrayed as the co-benefit. So very similar to what you're describing with the electric car, where you're deploying CDR because it means that you have a greener street, or because it means that you will have less energy bills, or whatever. Any way in which you can actually achieve another objective, and CDR is the extra thing that you get on top of that.
Okay, thank you, Mark, Chris, Nico, and Henrik, who spoke earlier in the session. That brings us to the close of the session. It does sound like some of the building blocks starts being in place. Countries are putting in place policies, start including it in the NDCs. still a long way to go on the cities and the local level. Private sector is running ahead a little bit, but we all need to jointly move forward. And with that, colleagues, I would like to close the session. Thank you to the panelists and Henrik, and to the audience, and also the people that may be watching online. Thank you.